Hi, my name is Samantha Reed. I am 28 years old, and I live in Chicago, Illinois. I work as a data analyst for a large logistics company where numbers and spreadsheets take up most of my days. I have never been the type who enjoys noise or attention, and perhaps that is why my family has long grown accustomed to seeing me as a shadow, quiet, diligent, but never mentioned. On the first night of December, as snow fell heavily outside my window, covering the streets of Lincoln Park, I curled up on the sofa with a mug of hot cocoa in my hand when my phone began to vibrate. The caller was my mother. At first, I thought it was a reminder about the Christmas gift list or a simple check-in, but her voice was more distant and colder than ever. "You are banned from Christmas until you apologize to your sister, Jessica." Other section. Through the background noise coming from the phone speaker, I could clearly hear the clinking of glasses, the cheerful sounds of Christmas music, and the laughter of my whole family. A party was happening somewhere in suburban Evanston, inside my parents' two-story house that had been decorated with twinkling lights since the beginning of the month. Only I was left on the outside. I tried to stay calm and asked why, though my heart was pounding. My mother answered with a tone as firm as if she were delivering a sentence. I had embarrassed Jessica at her birthday party in October when I accidentally mentioned the enormous credit card debt she had been hiding. I never intended to shame her. I simply could not keep pretending to smile while the whole family praised her success, knowing full well that I had often been the one scrambling to cover payments and conceal her recklessness. My throat tightened. Not out of fear, but from the bitterness rising inside me. Jessica, the golden child, always protected by our parents, allowed to make mistakes as many times as she wanted and always forgiven. And me, the other daughter, the one who for years had shouldered almost every household bill, from electricity, internet, and car insurance, to the hospital expenses after Dad's heart surgery. I did it all in silence, never expecting anyone to know, never asking for thanks. And yet now, just because I spoke a truth everyone else avoided, I was cast out of my own home at Christmas. I went quiet for a few seconds, then heard on the other end of the line Jessica's laughter blending with the sound of silver bells, as the whole family carried on celebrating as if I didn't exist. Have you ever been pushed aside by your own family simply because they refused to see all that you sacrificed for them? If you have ever felt that way, tell me where you are listening to this story from so I know that I am not alone. I set the phone down on the table, my hand still trembling from the cruel call. The sound of my family's laughter echoed in my head, forcing me back into old memories, into wounds I had long hidden beneath a facade of strength. I remembered my years at the University of Michigan, where I was both a full-time student and a part-time worker at the library and a small cafe on State Street to cover tuition and rent. While my classmates had the freedom to join student organizations or go out on weekends, I was usually finishing a shift at midnight, returning to a cramped room with the smell of coffee still clinging to my clothes. I never blamed anyone, because it was my choice. But the pain began every time I called home and heard my mother talk about Jessica, my sister, living in a sleek apartment in downtown Chicago, with my parents covering her entire monthly rent, including the parking fees in a luxury building I had never even dared to step inside. Jessica was always seen as the pride of the family. She attended lavish parties, posted photos on social media with a radiant smile, and received endless compliments from relatives about her success and charm. My parents proudly told everyone about their eldest daughter in marketing, while no one ever mentioned me, the younger daughter grinding through late-night shifts and buried under student loans. The constant comparisons, the way I was kept outside the glass display of family pride, gradually taught me to stay silent, to treat my own existence as a faint background in their brightly painted picture. When I graduated and started working in Chicago, I thought everything would change. I hoped that my financial stability would help me finally be seen more fairly. But the truth was, I never stepped out of the shadow of being the family's invisible bank. After my father's heart surgery 5 years ago, he needed financial support to cover what the insurance didn't. I immediately transferred what little savings I had to pay the hospital bills. At the time, I thought, this is family, of course I should do it. But once that door opened, it never closed again. I began holding the family phone plan under my name because they said I was better with technology and it would be easier to manage. Every month, money was automatically pulled from my account to cover calls, texts, and data that I rarely used myself. Then came the car insurance, when my parents missed a payment deadline and I stepped in again. They promised they would pay me back, but those promises faded as quickly as cigarette smoke at a weekend party. Jessica, of course, became a regular customer of my wallet. Sometimes she forgot her credit card payment, other times she threw an extravagant birthday party while still owing installments on a designer bag. I transferred her money again and again, always under the same promise. I'll pay you back next week. But when the next week came, all I saw were new photos of her on Instagram, at the spa, sipping cocktails at a rooftop bar, traveling in Florida, while I was carefully counting every dollar just to keep up with my student loan payments. The family's internet bill also fell on me. Once, I even helped pay part of Jessica's rent when she said she was going through a temporary rough patch. Each time, I comforted myself by thinking at least I was helping, that I could endure just a little more. But over time, I realized no one saw it as a sacrifice. To them, it was simply an obvious obligation I had to fulfill because I was more stable. The most painful part wasn't the money, but the way they treated my help as a given, even looking down on me for not living extravagantly or flaunting wealth the way Jessica did. At family dinners, when I drove up in my old Honda Civic, my parents would gush about Jessica's new car, praising how it was worth every penny. I once overheard my father half joke, half say in earnest, "Jessica really has a bright future, and Sam, well, at least she knows how to juggle numbers." They never realized it was those very numbers, the checks and the bank accounts in my name, that kept the entire family from sliding into debt. Every time I was left out of conversations, I felt like a backstage worker, the one handling the lights, the sets, the tickets, but never allowed to step onto the stage. The name Samantha Reed was rarely spoken as a source of pride. Instead, I was the bookkeeper, the frugal one, the child who doesn't cause trouble. And from those labels that seemed harmless, I came to understand a harsh truth. In my family, love was not given to the one who sacrificed, but to the one who knew how to create a dazzling illusion. That night, the snow fell heavier than usual. I sat by the window of my small apartment in Lakeview, watching the white flakes descend and quietly blanket the street outside. The glow of the streetlights filtered in, casting the whole room in a hazy light that felt both cold and still. I pulled my laptop onto the table, my fingers trembling as I opened a blank Excel file. No more phone calls to disturb me, just myself and a decision I knew would change everything. I began typing numbers. The first line I wrote, hospital bills for Dad after heart surgery in 2018. I remembered that day clearly. Northwestern Memorial Hospital had sent a bill for nearly $12,000, with insurance covering only half. My mother cried, saying they had no idea where they could find the rest. At the time, I had just started my first job and drained my only savings account to pay it off. I typed in the amount, added the date, and my chest ached as if cut by a blade. 4 years had passed, and not once had my parents mentioned it, let alone said the words thank you. Next, I pulled up the utility account that had always been under my name since day one. The monthly average was about $180 for electricity and $90 for water. I scrolled through the payment history. Every bill paid on time, not a single month missed over 4 years. I totaled the numbers, entered them into the cell, and when the figure appeared, I leaned back in my chair, my vision blurring with dizziness. Over $10,000 just for something my parents should have been responsible for all along. Then came Jessica. I created a separate column with her name. The temporary loans she took from me were always wrapped in the same promise. I'll pay you back next week. But week after week, all that remained were curt text messages and the photos she posted of vacations, manicures, and dinners at expensive restaurants. I wrote down each amount: $500 to cover that month's rent, $700 for an overdue credit card bill, $350 for an emergency flight to Florida. All of it added up to a figure I no longer had the courage to read aloud. Finally, I added the credit card payments I made just before their deadlines. Each time, either my mother or father would call with urgent voices. "You just need to front it, we'll pay you back right away." But that right away never once arrived. I had an entire trail of confirmation emails from the bank, proof of the times I used my own card to cover their recklessness. After 3 hours, my spreadsheet was filled with numbers, dates, explanations, and names of those who had benefited. When I pressed the total cell, the final number appeared, $39,642. I stared at it, my heart pounding as if each digit were a slap across my face. Nearly $40,000 in 4 years, enough to buy myself a new car, put down a deposit on a small apartment, or pursue an MBA program. But instead, it had vanished into my family's bills, Jessica's indulgences, and expenses no one would ever acknowledge. I clicked Save As and titled the file Family Expenses 2018-2022. I printed out every page and slipped them into a cheap folder I had bought at Walgreens. Each sheet rustled like a reminder of another cut across my heart. I paused, took a deep breath, and thought of Grace, my mentor at work. She once told me during a private meeting, "Samantha, boundaries aren't cruelty, they're love with a backbone. If you keep carrying everything, you won't just burn out, you'll also rob them of the chance to learn responsibility." At the time, I just nodded it off. But now, her words echoed in my mind louder than ever. I set the folder down on the table, leaned back in my chair, and stared at the Christmas lights shining from the apartment across the street. In that moment, I knew I had made a decision I could never take back. I was going to turn Grace's advice into action. I would cut everything. The cards, the plans, the auto pays. If they saw me as a living bank, then that bank was closing for good. I picked up a pen and wrote a short line on the cover of the folder. "This is what I have done for everyone, and this is what I will no longer do." The letters were shaky but firm. I closed the folder, and as a cold draft slipped in through the door, I suddenly felt a little lighter. Not because the pain had vanished, but because for the first time, I knew I was taking control of my own life. A week before Christmas, when all of Chicago was glowing with lights and "All I Want for Christmas" echoed through every cafe, I began cutting things off step by step. A part of me still trembled inside, because for years I had grown used to being the firefighter, used to the fear that, if I don't pay, everything will collapse. But then I remembered the number $39,642 on that spreadsheet. It wasn't just money. It was the years I sacrificed sleep, opportunities, and pieces of my youth to patch holes that were never mine to fill. The first step. I logged into my online banking account and went to the automatic payment section for the Evanston house mortgage. With just a few clicks, I canceled the autopay authorization. The system sent an email confirmation. "Payment authorization has been canceled." Seeing those words on the screen made my heart race. In my head, I heard my mother's voice from all those times she casually said, "Good thing you set up autopay, otherwise I would have forgotten." I shut the laptop, inhaled deeply, and felt as if I had just cut loose an invisible rope that had been binding me for years. The next day, I went to the AT&T store near my apartment. I handed over my ID and told the clerk that I wanted to split the family phone plan into separate accounts. He looked at me and asked, "Are you sure? Right now the account has 4 active lines." I nodded, my hand tightening around my purse. "I just want to keep my own number. The others can open accounts under their own names." The process took almost an hour, but when I signed the final form, I felt a cool rush sweep through my body. For the first time in years, I was no longer paying for calls, texts, and video chats I never made. Next came the electricity and internet bills. I logged into my ComEd and Xfinity accounts and removed my card from the payment options one by one. I remembered so clearly the times my mother said, "Oh, the connection is so fast, you're so good at picking this plan." Never realizing it was me struggling to pay for the premium package just so Jessica could stream movies and work remotely without interruptions. When the words, "No payment method on file" appeared on the screen, I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and felt as though a heavy weight had finally lifted from my shoulders. The hardest part was canceling the supplementary credit card Jessica still used. I called the bank, provided my account details, and requested immediate cancellation. The representative asked, "Are you certain? The supplementary cardholder has made multiple transactions this month." I gave a short laugh and said, "That's exactly why I need it canceled." When the agent confirmed the card had been deactivated, I imagined Jessica swiping it at some boutique only to see the word "declined" flash on the screen. The thought left me both sad and strangely relieved, as if justice had finally been served within the small boundaries of my own world. I didn't want my family to fall into complete chaos. A part of me still carried some feeling for them, even if it had been worn thin. So I prepared a detailed folder, almost like a survival manual. Inside, I wrote out every expense they would now have to handle themselves, which bank to contact for the mortgage, which customer service numbers to call for utilities, how to set up a new autopay for the internet. I even printed step-by-step instructions and highlighted the due dates. Not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to cut ties in an orderly way. I wanted them to see how thoroughly I had managed everything all these years, and I also wanted to leave them with no excuse to come running back to me. As I stacked the pages into a blue folder, I wrote a single line on the cover, "Instructions for taking responsibility." The words were brief, but to me, they felt like a declaration. I closed the folder, set it on my desk, and looked at it as if it were the final period at the end of a long sentence, the sentence of living like a shadow. Outside, the snow was still falling, and Christmas lights flickered through the window. I sat quietly, holding a warm cup of cocoa in my hands, and told myself, from now on, they will have to learn to live without the bank named Samantha Reed. On the 24th of December, when the entire city of Chicago glowed with Christmas lights, I unlocked my phone and was immediately met with a flood of notifications from Facebook and Instagram. The Reed family had just posted photos of their feast: a Christmas tree nearly 10 feet tall covered in lights and tinsel, a long wooden table draped in red cloth, candles glowing, trays of turkey, honey ham, and pudding. It looked like a perfect holiday postcard. Everyone was there: Dad, Mom, Jessica, the aunts and uncles from Indiana. They were all smiling, clinking glasses, celebrating, while I sat alone in my cold apartment, my name never once mentioned. That evening, just as I was about to close my laptop and make myself a bowl of hot soup, the phone rang. It was my mother, her voice more frantic than I had ever heard. "Samantha, the mortgage hasn't been paid. The bank keeps calling, saying if we don't send it in on time there will be penalties." I stayed silent for a long moment, listening to the clinking of silverware and the sound of Christmas music in the background. They were still feasting, still laughing, and only remembered me when money was missing. I took a deep breath and replied, "I'll come over, set the table, because I'm bringing a big gift for everyone." Half an hour later, I was standing at the door of my parents' house in Evanston. Inside, warm yellow light glowed through the glass, and laughter spilled out in waves. I pushed the door open, my shoes pressing down on the red carpet my mother rolled out every winter. No one expected me, so the room fell silent for a few seconds when I appeared. My mother looked at me, phone still in her hand, her eyes caught between relief and fear. My father forced a smile, trying to pull out a chair for me, while Jessica frowned, her lips painted a sharp red as if she were ready to spit out a complaint. I didn't sit down right away. Instead, I placed the thick folder on the wooden table, right beside the Christmas tree that filled the room with the scent of pine. The sharp thud made everyone flinch. I looked directly at my parents and spoke in a calm but razor-edged voice. "I've been paying for all of this for years. Here's the proof. But as of today, I am no longer this family's bank." My father froze, sinking into his chair, his eyes clouded as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for the folder. Page after page turned, the numbers, the dates, the hospital bills, the utilities, the internet, Jessica's credit card debts, everything laid out in black and white. She stared at the bolded lines, her hands shaking so badly the teacup on the table rattled with her movements. My father bit his lip, his face seeming to age 10 years in an instant. Jessica was the first to break the silence. Her face flushed red as she snapped, "You're so petty. It's Christmas Eve. Who brings up money just to ruin everything?" I turned toward her and pulled out a clear plastic sleeve filled with printed screenshots of our text messages, each line highlighted in yellow. "Do you remember these times you asked me for money? 600 for rent, 700 for your credit card, 350 for a flight to Florida? You promised to pay me back next week, but that week never came. Here is the proof." I slid the stack of papers across the table toward her. Jessica grabbed it, her eyes darting over each line before her face turned crimson with embarrassment. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but her voice cracked in her throat. You're trying to smear me," she finally shouted, but the cry sounded more like a feeble plea than an accusation. I didn't shout, and I didn't tremble. I spoke slowly, clearly, making sure every person in the room could hear me. For the past 3 years, I've carried nearly $40,000 for this family. I paid Dad's hospital bills, the utilities, the internet, and even the debts you, Jessica, treated like a joke. I did it all in silence, and in return, I was erased from Christmas. If family love only exists when I pour money into it, then I'm sorry, I don't need that kind of love anymore. My mother set the folder down, her eyes shimmering with tears. "We didn't know. If we had known you'd done so much." My father cut in, his voice rough. I thought Jessica handled it herself." I shook my head, cutting him off. It was all me. And I've waited 3 years just to hear a single thank you. Instead, I got a banishment. The air in the room thickened, broken only by the faint crackle of candles burning. Jessica bit her lip and looked away. A few relatives stood frozen, avoiding my gaze. I knew this moment would forever change how they saw me, no longer the quiet shadow, but the one who had just held up a mirror to the raw truth of our family. I straightened my back, looked around once, then exhaled softly. "I won't be staying for dinner. I only came to show you what needed to be seen. From now on, pay for what is yours." I slid the folder across the table, leaving it behind, then turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, my mother's faint voice called out, "Samantha, wait." But I didn't stop. I opened the door, and the cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the distant sound of Christmas music. For the first time, I stepped out of that house carrying nothing but myself. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the wind whistling outside the window and the low hum of the heater. I stretched, walked into the kitchen, and made myself a cup of coffee. When I opened my phone, the first thing I noticed was this. The family group chat, normally buzzing every morning with my mother's messages, Jessica's meal photos, or my father's random reminders, was completely silent. The last messages were still the jokes and chatter from the night before, just before I arrived and placed the folder on the table. After that moment, everything had gone dark, as if the whole crowded group chat had suddenly stopped breathing. For a second, it felt strange. For years, my phone had been constantly buzzing because of them, most of it small demands or indirect nudges for me to cover yet another bill. Now, the silence felt both empty and freeing at the same time. I sat down, sipped my coffee, and allowed myself to enjoy the stillness. Around noon, I happened to scroll through Facebook. The first post that appeared was from Jessica. A photo of the glowing Christmas tree from last night, with a bold caption that read, "So sad when someone with the same blood forgets family. Money can never replace love." Underneath, a few of her friends had left heart emojis or comments like, "You're right, family comes first." But I noticed the likes were far fewer than usual. There were even some dissenting comments from relatives who had always stayed silent before. Family has to be fair, not just take without giving. One cousin even wrote outright, "If it weren't for Samantha, this house would have been taken by the bank a long time ago." Reading those words, I didn't feel joy. Instead, a quiet sadness washed over me, as if the truth had finally surfaced, but far too late to heal the wounds already carved deep. Jessica would no doubt be furious about losing the halo she had always basked in, but I no longer had the energy to care. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my father. He rarely called me directly unless it was about a bill or an insurance issue. His voice was hesitant. "Sam, I need to ask you something. How do you set up autopay for the mortgage? I've never done it. I always relied on you. The bank says they need an account number and some login." I froze for a few seconds, caught between surprise and bitterness. For the first time in years, my father was admitting he didn't know how to handle the things I had always taken care of. I inhaled deeply, then slowly explained. "You'll have to call the bank's customer service directly. They'll send instructions by email. You'll need to use your own name to verify." He went silent for a moment, then said softly, "Thank you." After hanging up, I sat still in my chair. Deep down, I knew that call was not just a technical question. It was the first sign of change, a quiet admission that I was no longer their default lifeline. That evening, I received a message from my mother. Just one short but heavy line. "I never realized you did so much. We'll try to handle things ourselves." I read it over and over again. No apology, no clear thank you, but for my mother, simply admitting she had never realized was already a major step. I set my phone down on the table and closed my eyes. Tears welled up, not from pain, but because at last, a piece of the truth had reached them. The next day, the family group chat was still silent. No more constant notifications, no more playful messages, only a long, heavy quiet. I began to realize something. The truth carries its own power. It doesn't need me to shout, it doesn't need me to beg. All it needed was for me to place it on the table, and it would reshape the way everyone saw things on its own. And in that shift, for the first time, I felt I was no longer small. In the days after that confrontation, I noticed a strange emptiness in my life. My phone rang less, my inbox no longer flooded with payment reminders. My small apartment in Lakeview suddenly felt bigger, brighter, as if I had thrown open a door and let the wind rush in. At first, that silence unsettled me. I had grown used to being pulled in every direction by demands, to my heartbeat spiking every time the phone rang, to the guilt that washed over me whenever I said no. But gradually, I understood that this silence was not a loss, it was a gift. I began to focus on my own future. One afternoon, while snow fell thick outside the window of a cafe near my office, I sat in front of my laptop and pressed submit on my application for the part-time MBA program at Northwestern University. It was something I had dreamed of for years but always pushed aside, thinking I had to save money for my family instead. When the confirmation email arrived, my heart pounded as if I had just crossed a threshold. I was no longer the shadow living in sacrifice. I was investing in a future that belonged to me. I also created a new fund. Before, I always kept an envelope in my drawer labeled Family Emergencies. Inside was the money I set aside for those panicked calls from my mother or Jessica's urgent messages. But now, I took out that envelope, emptied the remaining cash into a separate savings account, and wrote a new label. Personal Plan. That single, simple act felt like breaking free from chains. That money was no longer meant to patch the endless holes of others, but to nurture my own dreams. The first dream was a trip to Iceland to see the Northern Lights. I remembered reading an article once with the line, "Those who have endured the longest darkness will see the aurora most beautifully." That sentence carved itself into my memory, as if it had been written for me. I opened a new folder on my computer, named it Aurora Trip, and began researching the costs of flights, hotels, and aurora hunting tours. Every time I transferred a small amount into my travel savings account, I felt my heart brighten. Each dollar saved was no longer a worry about having enough to cover someone else's bill, but a stepping stone on the path toward my own dream. In the evenings, I often sat by the window of my apartment, gazing at the lights from the tall buildings in the distance. I would put on a soft jazz playlist, brew a cup of tea, and allow myself to savor the quiet. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for living for myself. Instead, I felt peace, as if my whole body were wrapped in a warm, gentle blanket. It was a feeling so different from the exhaustion I once knew, when every decision I made was chained to the thought, if I don't help, what will happen to them? Now I understood. If they couldn't learn to take responsibility, that wasn't my fault. I began changing even the smallest habits. Instead of rushing straight home after work to check bills, I stopped by the gym and joined evening yoga classes. I bought books on psychology and personal finance, the kind I had always wanted to read but never had time for. On weekends, I experimented with cooking, inviting a few close colleagues over, and realized I could build a new family with people who truly valued me. One evening, Grace, my mentor at work, invited me out to dinner. I told her everything, from the Excel spreadsheet to the folder I placed on the table. Grace listened, then smiled. "Sam, you've done what many people never dare to do in their entire lives: set boundaries. You didn't just save yourself, you gave them the chance to grow. Never forget this: love is not paying someone else's bills." I laughed, tears rolling down my cheeks faster than I could wipe them away, because it was the first time someone told me I had done the right thing, instead of accusing me of being too harsh. End of verse. That night, I went home, opened a brand new notebook, and wrote in bold letters on the first page, "I have the right to live for myself." I taped that page to my refrigerator so that every morning when I woke up, I would see it. And each time I read it, my heart felt a little lighter. It wasn't that I no longer loved my family. I still cared, I still worried, I still remembered the warm memories of childhood. But I had learned that real love is never tied to the numbers in a bank account. I no longer felt guilty for keeping money for myself, no longer thought I was selfish for saying no. Instead, I felt stronger, freer, and more at peace than ever before. As New Year's Eve approached, with Chicago glowing under holiday lights and stores on Michigan Avenue packed with last-minute shoppers, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hesitated before picking up, my heartbeat quickening. For weeks, she had only sent a few short messages, never daring to call directly. This time her voice came through, stripped of its usual authority or commanding tone, carrying instead a trace of hesitation. "Sam, if you want, there's a seat for you at the dinner table tonight. I think you should come home." I stayed silent for a few seconds, listening to the music and the clinking of dishes in the background. The whole family was probably gathered, preparing for the New Year's Eve dinner. A part of me still longed to sit at that table, to be part of that atmosphere. But another part reminded me, an empty chair does not equal love or respect. I gripped the phone tighter and asked slowly, "Is there respect too, Mom, or just a chair?" The other end went quiet for a long time. I could almost picture her sitting in the kitchen, eyes darting around, unsure how to answer. At last, she said, I don't know yet, but I'll try." That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in my apartment, cooked myself a bowl of pasta, and put on an old movie on Netflix. When fireworks began bursting across the Chicago sky, I stood by the window, sipping a glass of red wine, and told myself, not being there doesn't make me any less their daughter. But accepting a seat without respect would only mean allowing myself to be diminished again. I chose silence as part of my new boundary. A few days later, my father called me. He rarely did, and when I heard his voice, I realized it was unlike any other time before, no longer firm, but tired, tinged with sincerity. "Sam," he began, then paused for several seconds as if searching for words. "I'm sorry for treating you like a wallet. You saved this family so many times, but I never once said thank you. I was wrong." I tightened my grip on the phone, my eyes stinging. For years, I had never heard my father say the words, "I'm sorry," to me. He had always maintained a strong, sometimes imposing image. Now, he lowered his voice and admitted it. I didn't respond right away. I took a deep breath, then answered softly, "I know, thank you for saying it." His voice shook. "I want to learn how to handle things myself. But if there are times I don't do it well, I hope you'll be patient. I let out a small laugh, a rare smile free of bitterness. Dad, I don't want you to be perfect. I just want to be respected. I stayed silent for a few seconds, hearing the music and the clinking of dishes in the background. The whole family was probably already gathered, preparing for the New Year's Eve dinner. A part of me still longed to sit down, to be part of that atmosphere. But another part reminded me, an empty chair does not equal love or respect. I gripped the phone tighter and asked slowly, "Is there respect too, Mom, or just a chair?" The silence on the other end stretched on. I could picture her sitting in the kitchen, glancing around, unsure how to respond. At last, she said, I don't know yet. But I'll try. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in my apartment, cooked myself a bowl of pasta, and put on an old movie on Netflix. When fireworks began bursting in the Chicago sky, I stood by the window, sipping a glass of red wine, and told myself, not being there didn't make me any less their daughter. But accepting a chair without respect would only mean allowing myself to be diminished again. I chose silence as part of my new boundary. A few days later, my father called me. He rarely did, and when I heard his voice, I realized it was unlike any other time before, no longer firm, but tired, with a thread of sincerity. "Sam," he began, then paused for several seconds, as if searching for words. "I'm sorry for treating you like a wallet. You saved this family so many times, but I never once said thank you. I was wrong." I gripped the phone, my eyes stinging. For years, I had never heard my father say the words, "I'm sorry," to me. He had always carried himself as strong, even domineering. Now, he lowered his voice and admitted it. I didn't respond right away. I just took a deep breath and answered softly, "I know. Thank you for saying that." His voice shook. "I want to learn how to take care of things myself, but if there are times I don't get it right, I hope you'll be patient." I let out a small laugh, a rare smile free of bitterness. "Dad, I don't need you to be perfect. I just want to be respected." Hawatri. A year passed quickly. This Christmas Eve unfolded in silence, no clinking glasses, no loud music, yet in my small apartment there was a peace I had never known before. I sat in the armchair by the window, holding a cup of hot cocoa, eyes drifting out to the street. Strings of lights hung along the road, glowing against the thick snow blanketing the sidewalks. Families walked by carrying gifts, their laughter echoing, stirring in me memories of past Christmases, but not warm ones, only a deep scar. I remembered clearly the moment last year when my mother called after the party and said, "We saved you a portion. It's on the porch, come pick it up." I drove through the snowy night, stopped in front of the house, and saw a foil-covered plate left on the frozen steps. On it were a few slices of cold turkey, a hardened scoop of mashed potatoes, and a cracked cookie. I stood there for minutes, my hands numb, my chest tight. I remembered the neighbor's cat circling the plate, as if even it was surprised a human being could be treated that way. I left the food where it was, got back in my car, and drove away. In that moment, I understood I hadn't just been excluded from the table, I had been excluded from family itself. Now, as I gazed at the Christmas lights outside my window, I quietly promised myself never to return to being an outsider like that again. I had learned a costly lesson. True love never needs to be bought with money or silence. If the price of a seat is paying the bills, or living as a shadow just to belong, then that isn't love at all, it's a cruel transaction. And I no longer wish to take part in those transactions. I set my cocoa down on the table and reached for the blue folder on the bookshelf. It was still there, neatly tucked away, like a quiet reminder. I opened it and looked over the numbers, the expenses, the borrowed money messages Jessica once sent. It all felt like a slow-motion replay, reminding me of the time I lived like a walking credit card. But now, the folder was no longer evidence for confrontation, it had become a keepsake. It reminded me that I had once been drained, once been dismissed, and it reminded me too that I had found the courage to stop. I want to share this with anyone listening to my story. Setting boundaries is not selfish, it is how you protect yourself. For years, I misunderstood, thinking love meant enduring, tolerating, sacrificing without condition. But now, I see the truth is the opposite. If you allow others to step across your limits again and again, you don't just lose their respect, you lose yourself. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you abandon your family or stop caring. It means you love them in a way that gives them the chance to take responsibility instead of consuming your life. I also want to remind you, love should never be bought with money or silence. If you find yourself always the one paying, always the one apologizing when you've done nothing wrong, always the one staying quiet to keep the peace, then stop and ask yourself, is that truly love? Family is not a financial contract, nor is it a play where you must pay admission just to be present. Real love must come with respect, with listening, not with bills and bank balances. And finally, I want to say the most important thing. If your family only sees you as a walking credit card, have the courage to pull the plug. I know it's hard. My hands shook when I canceled autopay. I cried when I cut off Jessica's supplementary card. I felt hollow when the family group chat suddenly went silent. But after all of it, I found something I had never had before. Peace. Peace in waking up and knowing the money I earned would serve my own dreams. Peace in no longer living with the fear of what will happen to the family if I don't pay. Peace in knowing that, for the first time, I was no longer a shadow. On New Year's Eve, I sat in my apartment, the lights from the small tree in the corner reflecting on the wall. I don't yet know where I will spend next Christmas. Maybe I will go back, if I see real change. Maybe I will go somewhere far away, to a place where the sky is blanketed in snow, to watch the northern lights in Iceland as I have always dreamed. But one thing I know for certain, I will never again be locked out by my own wallet. I have returned responsibility to the adults in my family, and I have kept for myself the most valuable thing of all. The right to live a full life, without needing anyone's permission. I raised my cup of cocoa, looking out the window as the first sparks of fireworks lit up the Chicago sky. I smiled a small smile, but a true one. Because after everything, I had found again what I once thought I had lost forever, myself.